I've got the microphone.
Welcome, everyone, to our roundtable discussion of Peter Grimes with artists from the production that will be opening a week from this coming Saturday night. I am personally delighted to see this opera come back, and I'd like to introduce it very briefly and differently than we normally do for the Artists Roundtable. Rather than to introduce the artists immediately, just to introduce the fact that this piece, Peter Grimes, has a strong San Diego County connection. The composer and his lifelong partner, Peter Pears, were in the United States between 1939 and 1942. And in 1941, they were invited by the husband and wife piano duo team, Ethel Bartlett and Ray Robertson, to come visit them in their home in Escondido. This was the summer of 1941. Now, I remember Escondido from 1951. It wasn't much better. And I don't know how they dealt with the heat, because they were here from May through September. While Britain was here, he wrote or worked on the Scottish Ballad for two pianos and orchestra, and his String Quartet No. 1 in D, which was premiered in Los Angeles in September 1941. And during this time, in traveling to Los Angeles, they were rummaging through an old bookstore and found the British periodical The Listener, which had an article in it about George Crabbe, the 19th century poet, who had written the epic poem, The Burro. Britain had not really known anything about George Crabbe and read this wonderful article and was struck by the stories of an area of England on the East Coast where he himself was raised, Lowestoft, and Crabbe came from Aldborough. They got a complete copy of the poem at a second-hand bookshop and began discussing the possibility of an opera based on the Peter Grimes section of the poem, The Burro by George Crabbe. And there is a postcard dated July 29th, 1941, which was when they were here in Escondido, writing to a friend on the East Coast that he was introduced to the poetry of George Crabbe and the character of Peter Grimes, perhaps an opera someday, exclamation point. So I think it's wonderful that there is this connection with San Diego County and with, of all places, Escondido. And I do know from other sources that Britain, after spending time in Escondido, couldn't wait to get back to Great Britain. And I'm sure the weather had an awful lot to do with it in that summer of 1941. I tried to do some research today on weather in 1941 in Escondido. It was going to cost me $35 to give you one sentence about what the weather was like, so I wasn't going to do that. So that's the background, and that's our very special connection with the piece. And it's a piece, of course, that's considered the finest English opera of the 20th century. So I think we need to be very, very proud that we in San Diego County played some role, albeit minor, with the creation of this piece. Let me introduce our panel. Immediately to my right, soprano who is singing the role of Ellen Orford for the first time. She was last with us as Fiordalici in Così fan tutte. Prior to that as Pamina in the Zandra Rhodes Magic Flute, Jennifer Casey Cabot. Our tenor in the role of Peter Grimes, the title role, previously here in the role as Mitch in Andre Previn's A Streetcar Named Desire, and as Lenny in Carlisle Floyd's Of Mice and Men, and a very wonderful recital at Sherwood Hall for us, Anthony Dean Griffey. Next to him, our stage director, who was last here directing Giulio Cesare, also directed Ariodante and Norma in recent seasons, John Copley. The conductor of this particular production of Peter Grimes is a noted Britain expert, and knew the composer personally very well, worked with him, and I'm sorry to say hasn't been here since 1991 when he conducted Albert Herring. This is Steuart Bedford. The baritone who will be singing the role of Captain Balstrode. He was last with us as Posa and Don Carlo, and prior to that as the Count in The Marriage of Figaro, Rod Gilfry. The mezzo-soprano singing the role of Auntie, although that's just what they call her, who was last with us as the innkeeper in Boris Godunov, and prior to that as Berta in Il Barbiere di Siviglia, Judith Christin. The bass, who will sing the role of Swallow, who pretty much dominates the prologue of Peter Grimes. He was last with us as Frank in Die Fledermaus, and prior to that as Bartolo in Barber and Mustafa in L'Italiani in Algeri, John Del Carlo. And we do have a debut artist, a mezzo-soprano singing the role of the wonderful Mrs. Sedley, Janice Meyerson. So, very briefly, the opera is about a fisherman in a small East Anglian fishing village whose manner and ways of dealing with people set him off from the rest of society in the village, the borough. He hires apprentices to help him on his boat in the very rough and sometimes violent life of fishing for a living, who has an apprentice die at sea under his rough treatment, and who, because of his odd and rough-hewn ways, is suspected of murder through physical abuse of the boys by the rest of the village. The gossip and the animosity of the people in the village eventually drives him to his demise. The point of the story seems to be a community, once it unleashes its suspicions on the outcast, will act inexorably to destroy that which seems alien or queer or different. I'd like to start with our stage director, John Copley. There's a considerable difference between the Peter Grimes of the poem, of the George Crabbe poem, and the Peter Grimes who's the main character of this opera. Can you talk a little bit about the difference and what it was that perhaps struck Britten and his librettist Montague Slater to create an opera out of this character?
The character in the Crabbe poem is vile. It's so strange that Britten and with Piers wrote this piece, because there is nothing compassionate or interesting. He's just a simply horrible, sadistic monster in the Crabbe poem. And the fact that Ben wrote this opera for his partner, Peter Piers, who is completely the opposite, I have to say. And the interesting thing that I find, because I've been connected with this opera since I was 15, because I did play the boy. I played the apprentice myself in the Covent Garden production. I wasn't, as it says in the paperwork, I wasn't the original boy, but I came into the Covent Garden production in 1949. I was 15, and I've grown up with it all my life, and I've directed it a lot. And the interesting thing for me is how the opera has changed since I was in it. With Peter Piers and Joan Cross and Richard Lewis and Elizabeth Abercrombie, who I did it with as well. It was a much more kind of rather nice affair. There wasn't the passion. There wasn't the passion of Ellen and Peter Grimes. They were like brother and sister. I mean, Peter Piers was very much a gentleman, you know. They came from frightfully good backgrounds. And Joan Cross was the director of the Sadler's Wells Opera during the war. She was a very fine singer. She sang Marschallin and Sieglinde and all sorts of roles at Covent Garden. And she was my mentor. I've studied with her for a long time in my teens. And she was a kind of monster. She was the head mistress, and she was very bossy. And when she did Ellen Orford, it was like she was running the show. And we sort of grew up with that, and there was no kind of compassion and no sadness. We never wept at the end. Isn't that an awful thing to say? But we didn't feel a lot of sadness. but it's changed completely since then. John Vickers made a huge difference when he did it at Covent Garden with Elijah Mashinsky did that production with Colin Davis conducting wildly vigorously, and the character took on a completely different persona as John Vickers, who's very strong, very tough, very virile, and all of the things that is written in the piece. But we hadn't really seen it like that before. It was curious, actually, that Ben didn't like it, did he? Well, he didn't like he didn't like John Vickers. He didn't like John Vickers.
I was going to ask about that because
let me just. The point I think about the John Vickers thing is that John Vickers turned Peter Grimes into something of a monster with no redeeming features, and that was what Britain didn't like. I mean, whether it matter, the result of all that was, of course, he was rather loud, and he didn't care for that very much. And but what he really disliked was that you could not have any sympathy with the character of Peter Grimes in John Vickers' performance.
Oh, well, I have to say I can't agree, because I thought John Vickers was riveting, and I felt deeply for him. And Heather Harper, they did it together. I was very, very touched by that. But it's so interesting doing it, because I've done it a lot. And I'm not BSing, but we've got the most fantastic cast. Everybody in this cast is absolutely spot on. So I don't really have to do anything. I'm planning to go home tomorrow, actually. We've sort of ploughed through it, and they all know how to do it, and they're doing it just really marvellously, and it's very touching already, and we have a little way to go, but I think it's very exciting. And of course, it is the best, one of the best operas of the 20th century. And every opera company has done it. I don't think there's an opera company in the world that hasn't done it at some point. And I mean, they did it in Tokyo quite recently. Can I tell them this? Can I really tell them this? But, am I allowed to tell them? It was done by Japanese people. And they were singing in English, of course, it was very Japanese. And in the last act, Mrs. Sedley has a line, and she says, "It's no longer suspicion, it's fact." And this Japanese lady says, "It's no longer suspicion, it's fact."
Now they have something to listen for when I do it.
So you could wait for that. That comes in the last act. And you can all clap when she does it. Anyway, I mustn't be rude now, because that's me done. They want to hear from you lot.
John, you can't tell that story, please. Well, let's turn to Mr. Bedford. You worked with the composer very closely as the premier conductor in his last work for the stage, Death at Venice. But you also had a long-time connection with him that predates that. Can you tell us briefly about Benjamin Britten, what he was like as a person to work with and as a composer?
Well, they have two very different things. The person he worked with was very different to the person that you, off the professional circuit, as it were. I first met him because my mother was one of the first Lucias in The Rape of Lucretia in 1946. And so we were a family of 3 boys, and fairly wild at that. And he and Peter were often around at our house. He was very friendly with my mother. They got on very well. They had a very close relationship, really. And so I knew them as fun, both of them. And we had extraordinary sort of hijinks at home sometimes. My father had once shown us how to make a potassium chlorate bomb, which consisted on wrapping up a spoonful of potassium chlorate, mixing it with sugar and wrapping it up in a piece of Bronco, which was the old, remember the old toilet paper we used to have, which was sort of hard. And, I quite like it now. And then you'd take refuge behind a sort of crate and whack it with a hammer. And it went off with the most wonderful explosion. We did this one evening when Piers and Britten were around. We showed them this, and they were delighted with it. And Peter, who was always a bit adventurous, got the hammer out, and we'd made a particularly big one. And he smashed the hammer down without any protection. It went off with an enormous bang, never anything like it. And the neighbours all came out and said, "Well, is there something gone right? We've blown up." Created a great sort of sensation in Hampstead Garden suburb, which is, of course, a very high-class area in those days. Anyway, but as a professional musician, he was a very serious man to work with. I worked with him on practically all his operas. In fact, the only two I didn't work with him on were Grimes and Gloriana, but there were 11 others which I either conducted or worked with him on very closely or assisted him on. And one of the things, of course, that's talking about assisting, I did assist him on the original recording of Midsummer Night's Dream back in 1966. And if you have the acetates, there's a nice picture, several nice pictures of me sort of playing around doing things, conducting the boys' choir and all that. And then when they brought it out on CD, all those pictures were gone. And what did we find on the front but a picture of Maestro Copley, nestling with John Piper and Benjamin Britten. So there you are. Anyway, but it was a serious business working with Britten, and if he trusted you, and he saw you were doing what he wrote and what he wanted people to do, and he was, bear in mind, one of those composers that wrote what he wanted, not like somebody, say Michael Tippett, who wrote millions of notes but couldn't care less whether anybody sang them or even played them, and just delighted that his music was performed. But Britten was very particular indeed, and he found many people didn't bother with what he'd written. And this, we're still trying actually to do it, because it's not easy to do. And all the innumerable markings, rather like a Mahler symphony that you find in his scores, are quite off-putting, and sometimes people find them cramping their style. But there's always a way around it, and there's always a reason for what he wrote, and it's always very interesting to go into it. And he was wonderful to me. I blush sometimes, and I behaved terribly badly on occasions, but he didn't seem to mind. I don't know, I somehow survived anyway. Not everybody did.
Well, let's talk about the main character, and with our tenor, there are, of course, as was mentioned before, monumental interpretations of the role of Peter Grimes in the past century. The two, of course, being Peter Pears, who created the role, and John Vickers. Did you dip into films or listening to the recordings that they made to sort of come up with your own interpretation, or did you assiduously avoid paying any attention to these two achievements? How did you approach the role with those two sort of monuments behind you?
It was very important for me to give my interpretation of Peter Grimes. I had my very first performance was a student performance 13 years ago at Tanglewood for the 50th anniversary of the American premiere of Peter Grimes, which was at Tanglewood. Mm-hmm. So when I auditioned for the role for Peter Grimes, originally they wanted me for the role of Bob Bowles. For me, a lot of people felt I was quite young to sing the role of Peter Grimes, but for me, Peter Grimes resonated deep within my soul, and I wanted to bring my interpretation to Peter Grimes, And during the mad scene, someone backstage told me, Mr. Vickers is in the audience tonight. And for about 5 seconds, I got a little nervous, and I never. I have such high respect for John Vickers. It was important for me to come up with my own interpretation. So I've never heard or seen John Vickers' interpretation of Peter Grimes or Peter Pears. So what you see is only my interpretation. I don't call it the definitive, performance. I just call it my interpretation. And it was funny recently when I sang it at the Met. Someone told me that there was a kind of an outburst at the end of the show and said, "Oh, Griffey got it all wrong." And then someone said, "No, he got it all right." "No, well, when I heard, John Vickers sing it." "No, when I heard, So I think it's great. I think it's exciting when operas like that. It's like a sporting event. So
that is very exciting. I did happen to see Vickers do it in 1985 at the Met. I think it was one of his last performances in the role. And I've got to say, it was one of the most gripping theatrical experiences of my life. I have rarely seen anyone so completely inhabit a role. It was really pretty amazing. But as I've gotten to know the piece better and I've gotten older, I appreciate much more the more lyric qualities of the piece that are much more upfront in Peter Pears' rendition of it, as well as in yours. I mean, I think we see the artist and the dreamer in Peter Grimes more in your interpretation, which I saw on HD thanks to the net, than in Vickers. But it's, again, as you point out, it's not that one is right or one is wrong. I mean, we could say these things about any role, that you can interpret it in so many different ways. But I guess because it's such a new opera, relatively speaking, as opposed to a Tosca or a Traviata, that maybe it's a little bit more controversial in those terms. You think? I wonder.
I think so, but I think that's great that there is this, because I think people still, have very strong views of what Peter Grimes should be like.
Mm-hmm.
And so I even, I think this is my 7th production, but I probably have performed the role actually maybe 45, 50 times, which is not a lot compared to some people that sing, 350 performances of Butterfly or, So working with John Copley has been, amazing. I did an interview yesterday and someone said, well, you've done the role several times. And I said, no, but as an artist, I hope I never get to the point where I'm a finished product. And working with John, he's given me some new ideas and new layers to the character that have sparked my imagination. So I think in this production, you'll see things that you didn't see me do in the Met production, So I think it's, you have to be adaptable as an artist. And I think that's what helps you continue to grow as a person and as an artist. So
I'd like to approach two folks who are singing roles for the first time. First of all, Jennifer, you're creating Ellen Orford for the first time for you, and what was the process like of learning this role? Were you familiar with the opera at all before?
Oh yeah, this opera, as we were talking about, is one that we've probably all seen and heard about for most of our operatic training and profession. And when it came to be offered to me, I was thrilled. And that was 3 years ago, a little over 3 years ago, that I knew I was doing it. So I had a really long time to think about it and let it germinate and get out the score and rent some different productions of it and see all the different ways. But it isn't until working with John and being here that at least the way I work, I don't come in with a steel plan. I very much feel like it has to do with the imaginations that come to the table. And
that are in the room.
That are in the room.
Mm-hmm.
And the process has been illuminating for me because I was puzzled by who Ellen is. She seemed so contained, and I wasn't sure, does she really love him, or is it more like a mother or a school teacher? And it has changed. It's to me, it's more emotional, it's more passionate. And I'm still working on finding all that, because she is a very different character than, say, a Violetta or a Mimi, where you play the drama not to provoke sympathy or tears, but it's just so much. She's not the title role, and her role is, her heart is broken in this opera, but Peter is the one who's expressing a lot more of his hidden life. We don't get to see that from Ellen. She's reacting a lot, and that's a challenge. But I must say, Benjamin Britten wrote some exquisite music for her. So I think the key is in the music.
Oh, the embroidery aria and the aria in the first act, Let She Who Casts the First Stone, or what? Yeah. Oh, it's glorious stuff.
Yeah.
Wonderful. How do you feel it fits the voice?
Oh, it's wonderful. It's like rolling off a log in a lot of ways. So the challenge is well, I shouldn't say that. Musically, it's challenging, and the tessitura is not so challenging for my voice type. But it's more, how you fill every word and every phrase, and that takes a lot of thought
and concentration. I would imagine. Yeah. Rod, you're approaching Captain Balstrode for the first time. How has that been for you? Was it a role that you had ever thought you would do or that you were looking forward to doing?
It wasn't my idea at all. Ian called me a couple of years ago and said, "How do you think about Captain Balstrode?" And I thought, I'm not sure. Maybe it's really should be played by, sung by a singer who's a little bit older than I am, perhaps a little wiser. And he pointed out that the first singer who ever sang it was 48. When he sang, he said, "How old will you be?" And I said, "Well, actually, I'll turn 50 just before we start rehearsals." So I guess I'm old enough. It's a very attractive role, though, because I see Balstrode as the voice of reason in the piece. Ellen I see as the voice of love, the voice of compassion. Peter is extremely insecure and kind of wild and untamed and wants to avoid the criticism of everyone in the town. And Balstrode is the one who sort of, in spite of the temptations that everyone else is succumbing to fall into like the mob psychology and to attack Peter Grimes and accuse him of murder and all these things. Balstrode is the one who sort of stands fast and opposes the craziness. He says, let's have reason. He talks about he comes up with lots of maxims. He gives lots of philosophy. He's very wise, and he's not boring, though. I mean, to be just the voice of reason sounds boring. He's not boring at all. He knows how to have fun. He's compassionate, but he really sees something in Peter that very few other people see, and that is that he's intelligent, that he's extremely skilled as a fisherman, that he's a person of real value who has, perhaps through fault of his own, but not necessarily, has fallen on hard times, has unfortunately had a young boy die under his supervision on a fishing trip, but he's sort of wants to see the goodness in people, wouldn't you say, John? Yes, I do. Yeah, and he really tries to support that goodness in Peter Grimes until it's no longer possible. In the end, unfortunately, he's completely wrong, because Peter is irresponsible, and this was highly, or at least the first death perhaps was of the young apprentice was perhaps something that could not have been avoided. He points out that the young boy came from a workhouse and was probably not in very good health when he began working for him, and so his health being compromised and then running out of water in the open sea for 3 days, he fell ill, and it's quite possible that Peter was not entirely to blame. But Peter's impetuousness really brings on the death of the second boy, and Balstrode really has been wrong. I mean, Peter is really irresponsible, and it's heartbreaking. But I respect him very much because he is the one who opposes the kind of crazy mass mob psychology of the sort of witch hunt that the town embarks on once they've decided that Peter has done something terribly wrong.
Now, these other three singers, Judith, Christin, John Del Carlo, and Janice Meyerson, are playing three, I think, very interesting roles. The thing about the borough of George Crabbe is that it is populated by the most interesting little people, characters in the village. It's rather like our Spoon River anthology, I suppose. And the opera is populated with these extremely interesting characters, and three of them are here. I don't want to say that these are minor characters or even compromario roles in any way. Britain has given lots of music and lots of stage time to all of these characters, and each one of them is an individual portrait of a character that I think is just fascinating. And because of that, I wanted to ask all three of them about these three characters. Judy, you play Auntie.
I play Auntie.
And John plays Swallow, who's kind of the mayor, the coroner, of the town. And Janice, you play Mrs. Sedley, who is a laudanum addict, and the village busybody. So any one of you can start, but I mean, just to talk about your characters and how Britain characterizes these people through the music or perhaps through the vocal lines.
Well, I've done 8 productions of this. 5 as Mrs. Sedley and 3 as Auntie. And my debut with San Diego Opera 25 years ago was Auntie. It was my first Auntie. And so I feel quite comfortable with these characters on many different levels. But I think Auntie is very temperate compared to these two. And she certainly knows how to hold her liquor, and she certainly runs a very tight pub, and she has a very, she is part of the group at sometimes with her anger with Grimes, but then she realizes mid-ensemble that she's created something seriously, and it's out of control. I'd say she's the female version of Balstrode in some way, in terms of being the kind older person, not without her faults at all. But Janice will go into detail of Sedley. Sedley is a very delicious character. Auntie's got the beautiful quartet to sing, and Sedley has her wonderful laudanum.
Mrs. Sedley is pure evil, I think. She doesn't have redeeming qualities as do some of the other people. But when you think about the evil and the mob psychology, I was thinking about the last scene of the opera, well, I guess it would be the penultimate scene when the entire chorus and all the soloists are screaming, Peter Grimes, Peter Grimes. And it's almost, in its ugliness, it's almost beautiful in the ferociousness. It's like a tornado. I come from Nebraska, a tornado country. And when you see a tornado, you know the destruction it's going to do. But you also are fascinated. You can't tear yourself away from the sheer physical beauty of it. And the music of when we're all screaming at the same time, and Maestro Bedford has told us, I want to see teeth on this, we're all screaming Peter Grimes. It's so ugly, the frenzy we work ourselves into over somebody who is the other, which is, of course, Peter Grimes. Everybody in the town is a hypocrite, basically. Well, no, I shouldn't say everybody. I'm a hypocrite because I talk about we all have to be upstanding citizens, and yet I'm addicted to laudanum, which they don't do anymore, right? It's tincture of... I've never tried it. It's tincture of... But we don't have Bob Bowles here, but his drug is religion. He's got a certain brand of religion that he doesn't shut up about, and we've got a couple of prostitutes. Those are your girls. Mm-hmm.
But and nice girls.
Nice girls. But, okay, Swallow, I'm sure.
Swallow. This is my third production of this great opera. And Swallow, very interesting character. Right from the very start, as you'll see, and the way John staged it, the way it is, he's really the one that really gets the people riled up, and he's already made the decision. You can just tell from the very beginning he's already totally against Peter, and he's already made the decision. So he's he acts as the lawyer, the judge, the coroner, as Nicolas pointed out, a man of all trades, but he's also got a side of him that he's a little bit lascivious. And in the third act, I have a scene with the nieces that I'm playing around with and so forth. So he's got a mischievous side, but basically he's a very pompous and arrogant fellow, and it comes across in the prologue, really sets the whole mood for his character. And it's a very, very interesting character. I'm enjoying it, and we're having a lot of fun with it.
Let's talk a little bit about the music of the opera. I mean, one of the things that I've noticed is that because Peter is an outcast, his music is very different from, it's built differently, it seems to me, than the music of the other characters. There seems to be a predominance of very wide melodic leaps, for instance. And as opposed to Ellen Orford's music, which seems to be step by step or a little bit more conjunct, your music as Peter is a little bit more angular. Does that capture it well? Does that stand up all the way through the opera, you think? That either Maestro Bedford or...
I sort of felt this might be my question coming up. I'm not sure that I necessarily agree with all that. Grimes's music is of the visionary sort. And he does some most extraordinary things, very soft singing, like The Great Bear and Pleiades, which he sings as everybody else is worried in the pub storm. In comes this wild figure, started talking about the astrology. It's all very strange. He's got a lot of visionary qualities about his music. But one thing I do want to say, in general, about the music is I know that people, how can I put it? I don't mean to be rude to anybody, but I know that there is always, in opera goes, a resistance to 20th century opera. Because everybody thinks, oh my God, this is going to be dissonant. And I've spent a lot of time, whenever I do these things, trying to... I usually have a piano, of course, which I can prove that these things are not dissonant at all. But the one thing that I just encourage everybody about this is please do not be scared by the fact that it's a 20th century opera. I mean, if you just have to listen to the opening of that first interlude, the one which is dawn in the village, and you hear the sound of the seagulls high up in the violins, and the waves, the power of the sea underneath, all printed, done with purely common chords, the chords that Mozart would have used. It's just that they're used in a slightly different order and in a slightly different way, and they're followed by chords you don't expect. But nonetheless, this is part of Britain's style. But it's entirely recognizable as tonal music. And it's also music that has incredible beauties. Ellen's embroidery aria, with the vocal line weaves around in a wonderful way. And the harmonies are absolutely sensationally beautiful. And there's a lot, and God help me, Ben, I'm sorry to say this, but there is a lot of things that could well have come out of Strauss. He wouldn't like me to say that at all, because he didn't, although he respected Strauss, he didn't really care for his music. But nonetheless, that wonderful quartet with Auntie, Ellen, and the two nieces at the end of Act 2, Scene 1, is pure Strauss, really is. And it is so beautiful. And the whole opera is charged with beauties of an extraordinary sort. There are, of course, violent moments as well, but a storm, which rages in between the first two scenes of the first act, is a tremendously powerful piece of music. And you don't end up by sort of closing your ears and thinking, oh my God. You get blown away with it, and it's just so exciting. And so there's tremendous excitement as well of all these beauties. It's an extraordinary piece.
It's interesting that Britten cut his teeth as a composer scoring documentaries under the auspices of the GPO, the General Post Office, and that actually while he was in California there was a flirting with the possibility of writing for the Hollywood studios, but that just didn't go anywhere at all, which is the movie's loss, because I think he certainly in all of his operas creates such a wonderful atmosphere and very specific descriptive music that carries a lot of imagery with it. I think particularly Dawn and the other sea interludes really tell a very specific story and draw very specific pictures.
Yeah, I also would like to add that it's so interesting for me too that I feel that each one of our characters has his or her own style of music that Britten has written that is just perfect for that character. It's just amazing. You can hear it when you come to listen to it. You'll hear Swallow's music. You'll hear all these people have their own style. It's just incredibly such beautifully well written music.
Yes, and also the sea is actually one of the characters of the opera. To me, it's like we've got Grimes, who's the other, and then we have all of us who are in the borough. Some of us are nicer than others. I'm probably the nastiest. But the third character really is the sea, and it's not just that those sea interludes exist as separate symphonic pieces on their own. You actually do see the sea in its various guises during the time, and they live so close to the sea. They make their living from the sea, and when there's a storm, it wrecks their property. I guess it's well, we're by the sea in San Diego too, so.
Well, of course, one of the most important characters in the opera is the chorus. John, could you speak to that just for a bit? Because, I mean, I imagine this is a rather sprawling work anyway, with so many characters, and plus a chorus. I mean, it must be difficult to...
No, the chorus is absolutely crucial. It's one of the best chorus operas, and they are doing it absolutely amazingly. We've been quite scared at the end of Act 2, in the middle of Act 3, when they go out for the murder hunt. It's marvelous noise, but the malevolence, I mean, of these San Diego people, I don't know where they get it from, but it's... what I actually want to say, though, something that we haven't actually touched on, that I think people coming for the first time need to understand. Peter Grimes, it's a long time before you actually really understand what Peter Grimes is about. It's the second scene of the second act. You see him harassed and made to look so foolish and treated idiotically. He is in a rage in the prologue. Nobody will help him with his boat in the scene after that. Everybody ignores him, turns their backs. They will have nothing to do with him. They won't bring the apprentice. He goes through a rage. He gets on the top of the capstan, and he has this marvelous moment with the sea. He sort of contacts the sea and the elements and the storm, and you begin to see the man. Then the next scene in the Boar's Head, everybody is dreadful, shocking to him, and he gets absolutely mad. He tries to smash up the place. You then see him in the next act with being vile with the child and hitting her. He bashes her, I mean, in an absolute temper, really crazy temper. And you begin to think, what is this opera? What is this man about? And then we see him in his hut in the next scene with the boy. And then you begin to understand the man. He wants to marry Ellen. He wants to have a family. He wants to be this person. He's not allowed to be. And he's just getting into this character when suddenly they start coming up the hill to get him. And then the terrible, terrible accident happens, and then you'll see what happens. But the character of Grimes takes a long time for the audience to understand. And his music is absolutely clear, isn't it? Every note is sort of written. You don't have to create anything. As a director, I don't have to create anything. It's there. And the chorus is just amazing because they're in every scene, and they're horrible, as Janice says. They're horrible and mean-spirited, and Ellen tries to put them into some sort of order. When they refuse to let Hobson bring the little boy from the workhouse, she says, I'll bring, and they say, Ellen, don't be ridiculous. You're leading us a dance. You're absolutely doing the wrong thing. And he's just on his own with her and Balstrode. He's just got this little bit of support. Anyway, could you please tell all your friends to come that haven't? No, because it is it's a very special piece, and it is one of the great, great pieces. I think we're going to do it quite well. I'm not going to say yet, but it's going to be pretty near what's needed. And it would be pity if people didn't actually come, because it's a 20th century opera. It's very accessible, isn't it? I mean, the language, it's in our own language. That's another wonderful thing. For me, the only flaw is some of the language is a tiny bit precious, but we forget about that because the effect of it all is so marvelous.
Just to finish up, I'd like to ask what's next for all of you. Let's start with Janice. Where are you going from here, and what's your next singing gig?
Actually, I'm going to England, not singing, on vacation. And then I go to Croatia for concerts. Then I'll be in Chicago for Katja Kabanova.
Oh, wonderful. John?
Yeah, I'm going home for a month after, and then I'm in Santa Fe all summer for Elisir, for Dulcamara. And then I go to the Met for Barber, Barbieri, Bartolo in that, and Bartolo in Le Nozze di Figaro. Yeah.
Judith?
I go to Florence in the fall to do a Cunning Little Vixen with Seiji Ozawa, and I'm back in Santa Fe 2010 for Albert Herring.
Rob?
I'm not going to talk about my engagements at the Met or La Scala because they're boring. My next engagement actually is at the Ravinia Festival doing Lancelot in Camelot.
No.
But that's not really what I'm excited about. The end of the year, I'll be appearing in Paris in the role of Captain Von Trapp in The Sound of Music with my daughter, playing the part of Liesel.
The proud papa, yes.
I really can't say it. It's not going to be very interesting, this particular one. I'm going straight from here to Chicago to another Britain opera, one called Owen Wingrave. It's a very different sort of piece.
This is rarely done, Wingrave, isn't it?
In 3 weeks' time. Do I? I don't know what's
I'm going home to have a rest. I'm 75 and I'm going to have 5 months at home. Can't wait.
Lovely. Tony?
After this, I go home for a week, and then I go make my debut with the Berlin Philharmonic and singing the tenor solos in Elias, Elijah in German.
Wonderful. And Jennifer?
Well, I look forward to some family time when I get home. But after that, I've agreed to do an opera that I have really not even heard. It's an opera by Dominic Argento, which I hear is a good thing. I don't know if anybody else knows any of his stuff. But this is called Casanova's Homecoming. And there is a role for one of his past loves, sort of a Donna Elvira role called the Countess in that I will be learning.
Great.
Ian, is it okay to talk about the future here? Oh, okay. Being I asked that, I'll be back here in 2012, is it? Oh, 2012. 2012 for Don Pasquale. So
bravo. That's great. Well, thank you all for being with us. We're so looking forward to Peter Grimes, and thank you for being here tonight. We appreciate it.